Let me begin with last year, 28 April 2014. This was the date when the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, was signed by Defense Secretary Voltaire Gasmin and U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines, Philip Goldberg. The agreement was signed before U.S. President Barack Obama arrived in Manila for a 2-day state visit. That month, following that month, May 2014, the first petition against the EDCA was filed in the Supreme Court, and some of those distinguished petitioners are here present, in addition to having been present during our committee hearing the past few months ago. That was the first petition. The second petition was filed virtually on the same date against EDCA in the Supreme Court. I have a summary of the EDCA petitions filed in the Supreme Court. In November 2014, oral arguments took place in the Supreme Court between the petitioners and the respondents. I have a summary of the Solicitor General's arguments. Last December 2014, as chair of the Committee on Foreign Relations, I chaired an inquiry in aid of legislation on the EDCA in response to news reports that certain Supreme Court justices wish to know the position of the Senate on EDCA. Some of our senators were there, Senators Angara, Marcos, and Cayetano. There were a number of distinguished resource persons who were present. I believe some of them are with us. Unfortunately, I've not been able to identify them correctly. But I have since sent a letter to all of you, my fellow senators, to sign a draft, quote, sense of the Senate, unquote, resolution on EDCA as co-author. From January to June, we circulated the resolution and asked the senators one by one if they wanted to sign the resolution as co-author. Most of the senators asked for time to study the resolution. In June this year, I filed this draft resolution entitled Resolution Expressing the Strong Sense of the Senate that any treaty ratified by the President of the Philippines should be concurred in by the Senate, otherwise the treaty becomes valid and ineffective. I sent a copy of my letter together with the draft resolution to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This was in response to news items in the media that the Supreme Court justices had been expressing the thought among themselves on what the Senate feels about the legality of the proposed EDCA agreement between the two countries, the Philippines and the United States. So, in effect, therefore, even only unofficially, we have already furnished the Supreme Court with more or less an intimation of how the senators feel about this draft resolution. And now I'm afraid I will have to go into a little technical discussion of the resolution. But if at the period of amendments or even the period of interpellation, if there is a necessity, I shall be happy to discuss the present two petitions pending in the Supreme Court against the EDCA, and in particular, the arguments of the Solicitor General in favor of this EDCA. I believe that I have 12 of my co-authors here, and if that is so, then we are all authors of the resolution. On behalf of my 12 other co-authors, I have the honor to sponsor Senate Resolution number 1414 entitled, quote, Resolution expressing the strong sense of the Senate that any treaty ratified by the President of the Philippines should be concurred in by the Senate, otherwise the treaty becomes valid and ineffective. Sa madaling salita, hindi maaari ang presidente na bigla na lang magpipirma siya mag-isa niya kasama ng kung sino pa ang pinuno ng estado ng kung ibang bansa. Kinakailangan ang sang-ayon ng Senado. Yan ang gusto nating liwanagin. Pag hindi pumayag ang Senado, hindi maaari yung treaty maski napirmahan at na-ratify ng ating presidente. The resolution that we propose we approve is constitutional law. The strong sense of the Senate that it embodies is a confirmation of its supremacy over any self-serving speculation that is forced subjectively on the Constitution. Central to the thesis of the Senate in this resolution are the general and the particular principles which combine as the law of treaties under the Constitution. The general clause is contained in the treaty clause of the Constitution, which reads in Article 7, Section 21, thus: no treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least 2/3 of all the members of the Senate. This is the only provision of the fundamental law that determines the validity and effectiveness of treaties as the law of the land. Other than concurrence of the Senate, no authority expressly transforms the treaty into law. Kaya, magandang sitwasyon ito kung international ang pinag-uusapan natin dahil sa ating mismong saligang batas, ang international law kaparte na o kahati na ng ating pambansang pambatas. The international law is part of the law of the land. This is the only provision of our Constitution which provides with respect to the efficacy of treaties and other international agreements in our country. This general mandate is brought into application to a treaty of a particular kind, namely as described in the Constitution, Article 18, Section 25, and I quote, foreign military bases, troops, or facilities shall not be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty duly concurred in by the Senate and recognized as a treaty by the other contracting state. Palagi tayong nag-aaway o ang ating bayanan ay nagkakagulo dito sa nakalagay sa ating Constitution na ito. Hindi lamang siguro dahil siya nagpalit na ang mga paligid natin, kung hindi nagpalit na din ang pag-iisip ng ating mga sambayanan. Foreign military bases, troops, or facilities shall not be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty duly concurred in by the Senate and recognized as a treaty by the other contracting state. In particular, concurrence of the Senate becomes an integral element of a treaty of a special kind in which concurrence forms part of its essential nature. This time, there cannot be a treaty without Senate concurrence. The treaty is void. Before the Supreme Court, even as I speak to you, is the constitutionality of the executive agreement concluded by authority of the President of the United States government entitled Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. In defiance of the Constitution, Article 18, Section 25, EDCA is without question a prohibited treaty of foreign military bases, troops, or facilities concluded in the absence of Senate concurrence. The oral arguments presented on behalf of the Executive Department in the Supreme Court by the Solicitor General clearly describes the EDCA in the nature of, quote, foreign military bases, troops, or facilities, unquote, and thus constitutes a judicial admission that it is of the category that shall not be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty duly concurred in by the Senate by authority of the Constitution, Article 18, Section 25. The textual, I'm very sorry, but my physical attributes refuse to support me this afternoon. I shall try to speak slower in comparison, and I shall, after this, request the Secretariat to provide, independently of the journal, a copy of my sponsorship speech. The textual composition of EDCA in itself evidences that it belongs to the category of prohibited treaty, Namely, it is a treaty of foreign military bases, troops, or facilities without the concurrence of the Senate. That such a prohibited treaty has been concluded by the Executive Department as an executive agreement testifies to its inherently prohibitory nature under the Constitution by reason of EDCA substantive provisions dealing with the establishment, location, stationing of the U.S. military forces, and storage of military facilities in Philippine territory. While the prohibitory nature of the constitutional mandate is inexplicably clear, the Executive Department, in what I can possibly attempt to call in order to wash off from the fundamental law in avoidance of legal consequences, which would include the Civil Code Article 5, which reads, acts executed against the provisions of mandatory or prohibitory laws shall be void when the law itself authorizes their validity. Perhaps the saving clause of this provision may call for the application of Senate concurrence to save the troubled executive agreement. But how does this agreement survive the demand of Article 7 of the same code in the following terms? Administrative or executive acts, orders, and regulations shall be valid only when they are not contrary to the laws or the Constitution. Kaya, dapat lamang itanong natin sa Ambassador ng Amerika pag nangmusta tayo sa kanya, paano natin mapatuloy itong EDCA na ito? Na maliwanag naman sa ating civil code na ang mga binabawal ng ating batas ay hindi maaaring bigyan sigla o bigyan buhay ng sarili ding nating batas. The defense of the executive agreement may rely on the Constitution, Article 8, Section 4.2, which provides that all cases involving the constitutionality of a treaty, international or executive agreement or law, which shall be heard by the Supreme Court en banc, shall be decided with the concurrence of a majority of the members who actually took part in the deliberations on the issues in the case and voted thereon. While this procedural provision deals with the constitutionality of a treaty, international or executive agreement, it does not pertain to any treaty, international or executive agreement over particular subject matter at issue on the constitutionality. Hence, on the remade assumption that this provision may be applicable to a case involving the constitutionality of a treaty or executive agreement, it must exclude from its applicability or interpretation the prohibited treaty as described with the particularity in the Constitution. That is, the case of constitutionality of a treaty or executive agreement concerning foreign military bases, troops, or facilities. The prohibitory character of this provision must command supremacy over the general and ambiguous language of the Constitution. We begin with the confidence that your humble Senate Resolution number 1414 is an expression of constitutional law on the matter of critical importance to the integrity of the Senate and the honor of this Republic. It is on this premise that we believe with the same confidence that the Supreme Court, I understand very soon, any time, will consider this resolution with decisive concern. Mr. President, I'm ready for interpellation. Sa madaling salita, gusto ngayon ng ating administrasyon na ang nakalagay sa Constitution ay pwedeng gawin na isang kasulatan ng nagpirma. Hindi ang presidente natin at hindi ang presidente ng Amerika, kung hindi ang nagpirma ay ang ating cabinet member lang na Secretary of Defense at ang kabila naman ay ang ambassador lang of the United States to the Philippines. Kaya ang pagtatanong lang ngayon ay ganito, ito bang ginagawa ng administrasyon at nasa ngayon ay nakabinbin doon sa harap ng ating Supreme Court? Kaya more or less, we are coming to a decision. It will either be like or against the decision of the Supreme Court. But in any event, we are prompted this afternoon by the reported inquiry that the Supreme Court wishes to know what are the sentiments of the Senate on this matter. I've already said that the language is very clear. There is no doubt. You cannot fudge this. Eh, ibig mong sabihin, nakalagay sa ating Constitution, walang magagawa sa pamamagitan ng isang kasunduan ang sino mang opisyal sa Pilipinas na hindi muna pumayag ang Senado. Pagkatapos ngayon ay dire-diretso na lang silang pipirma nitong tinatawag nilang executive agreement na wala man lang partisipasyon ang ating Senado. Eh, kapangyarihan ito na binigay sa atin ng ating saligang batas. Marunong ang mga gumawa ng saligang batas. Yung mga hindi pa natin naintindihan o naalaala na mga rason ay nagawa nila o naintindihan. Kaya gumawa sila nitong ating Constitution na saligang batas. Kaya kung ano yung nakikita natin sa Constitution, hindi yun ang sundin natin. Maliban lang kung gusto nating palitan ng Constitution, which is another thing. Mr. President, I'm ready for interpellation.
Thank you very much, Senator Santiago. The acting majority leader is recognized. Senator Ngara.
Mr. President, Senator Trillanes wishes to conduct some interpellation.
Senator Trillanes is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. In lieu of an interpellation, Mr. President, I would just like to manifest my opposition, with all due respect to our esteemed colleague, to the adoption of proposed resolution 1414, because I believe the EDCA is not a treaty or international agreement. The EDCA was intended by the Philippines and the United States to be an executive agreement to implement the respective obligations under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the two countries, the 1998 Visiting Forces Agreement, which is a treaty concurred in by the Senate and which has been upheld by the Supreme Court, and the United Nations Charter, of which both the Philippines and the United States are signatories. In a matter of speaking, the EDCA is merely an implementing agreement which is intended to implement the rights and obligations already previously provided under the Mutual Defense Treaty, the VFA, and the UN Charter. No new rights or obligations are created under EDCA. The EDCA merely amplifies and provides implementing details as to how the parties may exercise such rights and obligations in view of the prevailing circumstances. The EDCA is no different from the Mutual Logistics Support Agreement, which was signed in November 2007, and this same agreement between the United States government and the Philippines was not ratified by this August chamber, and I believe most of the senators present here allowed such a condition. And in fact, the MLSA expired back in 2012 without having to go through the same scrutiny that we intend this EDCA to go through. So that's just the humble manifestation, Mr. President, of this representation. Thank you.
In response to this question, may I say that I fully understand the genesis of this attitude about the EDCA, and that in response, further response, I must well read my draft resolution expressing the strong sense of the Senate that this treaty should be ratified by the Senate before it becomes effective. Halimbawa, una, sinasabi na ito ay bunga lamang, is merely an implementing agreement. Bunga lang siya ng Mutual Defense Treaty. Obsolete ng Mutual Defense Treaty. Yun pa yung 1951, wala nang saysay yun. Pangalawa, na ito naman ay executive agreement. Samantalang nakalagay sa ating Constitution ay treaty. Kaya sabi niya, kung kailangan palang how do you say? Kung kailangan pala ang consent ng Senado sa treaty, pag tinawag mo na executive agreement, hindi kailangan ng consent ng Senado. Eh bakit nila ginamitan ng ibang salita? Ang sagot dyan ay ganito. The executive agreement is a lonely infant wandering, unclaimed and unloved in our Constitution. Hanapin mo sa umpisa hanggang sa dulo, walang executive agreement except lang yung provision na yun na binasa ko kanina. There is no other provision in our Constitution about executive agreement. It does not tell us what is it, what are its provenance, who are its parents, who proposed it, for what good purpose. Yan lang ang isa lang na provision sa Constitution ang nakalagay. Kaya hindi natin maintindihan kung anong ibig sabihin. Una, kaiba ba ang executive agreement sa treaty? Binasa ba natin ang Vienna Convention and the Law of Treaties? Dahil wala rin yan doon. Kaya, sa paningin ng international law, wala itong executive agreement na ito. Meron ng presidente nag-issue ng executive order. Sabi niya, kaiba ang executive agreement sa treaty. Ang treaty ay hindi executive order at ang executive order ay hindi treaty. Yun ang sinulat ng presidente na yon. Ngayon, sa akin lang, very humble opinion, ibig lang sabihin ito na walang saysay ang natawag na executive agreement sa international law because it is not part of international law in the sense of being part of the law of the land such as the Philippines. Ngayon, tingnan lang natin sa Vienna Convention and the Law of Treaties, matitingnan natin kaagad-agad yon. Ngayon, kung lahat na lang nakasulatan na hindi treaty, ay tatawagin nating executive agreement para makalusot at pwedeng magpapirma maski sinong opisyal ng ating gobyerno, the President man or the Defense Secretary or some other reputably high position person, ay di, wala nang kailangan pang mag-consent ang Senado dahil all it has to say or all it has to do is to say this is an executive agreement as distinguished from a treaty. Ang distinction na nila is, pag executive agreement, hindi kailangan ang Senado. Pag treaty, kailangan. You see? So we'll go around and around. That will be the effect of that argument. But we are already familiar with this kind of argument. It has been raised as early as the Mutual Defense Treaty, as late as the Visiting Forces Agreement, and we take it with goodwill.
Thank you.
Mr. President,
Yes.
The manifestation confined itself within the context of the proposed resolution. I believe the arguments regarding whether the EDCA is an executive agreement or is a treaty should be left unto the Supreme Court, which it is now being studied and subjected to closer scrutiny. And I believe the Senate will just have to wait for that resolution and need not express its sentiment. And that's the humble manifestation again by this representation.
Again, well taken, Mr. President. I also know fully well where this attitude comes from. This is sometimes called the neutral constitutional attitude. Basta constitution, wala nang sinabi pa ang legislative or executive branches. Kung hindi, maghihintay na lang sila kung anong sabihin ng gobyerno. Anong masama dito? Kung merong question legal tungkol sa batas at parehong nakaharap sa the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, sino ngayon ang mauna sa kanila? Sinong patihuli sa kanila? O tatlo sila magsasabing, unahan na lang tayo. Kami ayaw namin eh. Kayo na lang kasi baka mali. That is the problem. So, we must remember the tripartite article of all constitutional law that government in a democracy must be divided into three and they are co-equal with each other. Kaya, kung meron man binbin ngayon doon sa Korte Suprema, dalawang petisyon yun. Nandoon na yung argument ng Solicitor General. Hindi maganda na attitude na yun na, aba, nandoon na pala sa Supreme Court. Huwag na tayo kumibo pa. Dahil, ang mangyayari, ang Korte Suprema na lang ang makakaroon ng kapangyarihan na mag-resolbar o magsagot ng question na yon. That is the problem of the neutral observer of constitutional issues.
Well, I submit, Mr. President, to the wisdom of the body. Thank you.
Thank you.